What's up, you guys? I'm Benjamin.
I'm Miranda.
And welcome to the Marriage is Ministry podcast. 3 years ago, Miranda and I got married, and the bedrock of our marriage is that it would be a representation of Christ, not only in church and in ministry, but behind closed doors, the Monday to Saturday that people probably do not see or do not consider. The idea of marriage is that it is the closest thing to intimacy with Christ that we could ever experience here on earth. So therefore, the experiences within a marriage, we desire to be an encouragement and ministry to those who are in a similar season or are prepping for such a season.
Yeah, so with that being said, we wanted to start this podcast talking about our birth story. But our birth story starts before our son, Adriel, was born, with our sweet baby that is in heaven, our first baby. So we found out we were pregnant, when was that?
2022.
2022. It was very unexpected.
So
we were processing through all of that. But we were very excited, of course, because children are a gift from God.
Yeah.
And we both have always believed that. So...
Sorry, if we pause, it's because our baby monitor's on and we are trying to record this in between naps. So
yeah. He might move around a little bit. That's okay.
Get it as real as we can.
Yeah, this is where it gets real.
Yes.
Anyways, so we found out we were pregnant, and we go to our first appointment.
We go to our first appointment about a week or two after.
Yeah.
This was in the thick of ministry. So for context, I was working full-time at a church in Los Angeles, and she was working full-time at a school in Fontana.
Yeah, so, we're both really busy, but, I'm feeling sick. I got the nausea going on, all the symptoms.
Oh, wow.
But we finally go to my first appointment. I think my mom, it was with my mom.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so my mom went with me to my first appointment. And, it's already my first time ever, obviously, going through this. And so we go in and they do the ultrasound, and, they're just kind of like, we don't really see much yet.
Yeah.
It could be that you're earlier than you think.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't really mention anything about miscarriage then. So at that point I was just like, okay, maybe, it was earlier than I thought.
Mm-hmm.
So the sac was there, but there really wasn't much inside. So they scheduled me for an appointment a few weeks later, just to hope that, baby is developing by then. So after this point, I was a little bit concerned in the back of my head, but I still was hopeful. I was like, okay, maybe I'm just earlier than I thought. I was still having symptoms at that point. After that, we had to wait a few weeks, but one day I went home from work, and I remember I had a cold or something.
Yeah, you were
sick. I was sick. And I don't know if that was just my body's response to what was going on, but I was sick and I had stayed home that day, and I started having some cramping and then a little bit of bleeding. And so what kind of happened then? Do you remember? Did I tell you?
Yeah, so I had just gotten to work. You actually went home from work early that day. So this was about mid-morning when all of this started happening with her. And I know that because I had just arrived to church, and literally as soon as I pulled up into the parking lot, that's when she texted me saying, hey, just a heads up, I'm experiencing cramping. I checked myself and I was bleeding. I don't know what that means, though in the back of our heads, we had already kind of had this notion that she miscarried. But of course, holding on to hope, I just told her, just let me know if it persists, if it gets worse, but in any case, you should probably go home. And a couple hours passed, literally 1 or 2 hours. And she texted me again saying, hey babe, I think I'm miscarrying. And by this point, I'm in the thick of work, just finished prayer meeting, and just trying to figure out what on earth to do. So the first thing I did was let my pastor know I need to go home, something's wrong. At this point, they already knew that Miranda was pregnant. Though early, she was pregnant. So they didn't ask any questions, they let me go. And I immediately went back to go see her. And I think this was arguably the hardest part for me. Working in LA, living 30 miles away, you deal with traffic pretty much day in, day out. It doesn't matter what time of day it is. And to have no choice but to sit in traffic when I know that my wife needs me, when I know that she's miscarrying, was probably the hardest 2 hours that I had to endure. Yeah. It was noon, and it took me 2 hours to get home. And that probably that 2 hour period of waiting for me to come home and going to the doctor with your mom was arguably probably the hardest part.
Yeah, so, you know, in that time that I'm waiting, I'd called like the nurse's hotline, and you know, they said that's probably what was happening, that I was miscarrying. And so my mom again went with me to the doctor. They got me in just to kind of see what was going on. And you know, I'm still like holding on to that little bit of hope, you know, as I think we all would. But they saw like in the scan that the sac was already moving down to miscarry, and that was really hard because, again, it's our first pregnancy. You have all these expectations that
hopes
things are going to go well and you're going to have a baby, and I never in a million years thought that's how my first pregnancy would go. By the time we got home, it wasn't long till I miscarried. I passed most of it, I think. Just a lot of heavy bleeding, and that was really difficult. I'm blessed that my mom was there, but I know that it was really hard for him that he wasn't there for that part. After that, it was just a lot of, you know, processing and with each other, and just sitting with it, really.
I think one thing that we both took away from this miscarriage is that we had to allow ourselves the time to sit in it, to grieve. Naturally, there were parts of us that just wanted to kind of move past it just because it was too painful. And I remember it was either a pastor or a therapist at the time, but somebody that I listened to at the time once said that you have to just sit and grieve what has happened. It's not because you want to stay there longer than necessary, but you also don't want to move past it to a point where you're not effectively processing everything that comes with, in our case, a miscarriage. And speaking for myself, that went against the grain of how I would respond to something like this. It's hardship in general. I would prefer to just kind of tackle it head on and then just keep it moving. And I knew, contrary to my nature, that was not going to work this time. It actually forced me to really look inwardly and reconsider a good number of things. So for those of you guys who do ministry full time, you could probably relate to this. I was going through a ministry burnout at the time and just did not do the greatest job of stewarding myself within the various responsibilities that I had at our church at the time. Along with that, I would just say yes to a good number of extracurricular opportunities, paid or ministry, whatever the case may be, and just wore myself so thin that the health of our marriage, the wellness of our marriage began to suffer. What really broke the camel's back was our miscarriage. It was a rude awakening to the reality that there were things we had to address. This was the point where we had no choice but to look at these things head on. I think it was about the first time at this point that I told you I'm burnt out. Like, I kind of refused to admit that, yet at the same time, this was a rude awakening to where I had to come to terms with that. I think it's also important to note around this time, so this is May 4th, that was the day you miscarried. I'm also 5 months sober from antidepressants. And if anyone that has been on medication, antidepressants or any other prescribed medication, there are often withdrawal symptoms that come with that. And one of the biggest things with antidepressants is when you get sober from them, you're effectively resensitized to certain things that you probably wouldn't respond to the same way when you're on them. And I think my antidepressants at the time served as a sanitizer for the burnout I was experiencing. It was easier to kind of just push through and deny the reality that I was experiencing that because I was on antidepressants. And it was by God's intervention on January 1st, 2022, that I got off of them. Now, mind you, I tried getting off of my antidepressants twice the year prior, and I was kind of dumbfounded by this overwhelming conviction from the Lord. So I literally asked him, it was the first time I was probably candid with Christ, why? Like, why get off of it this time? What's the difference? And I had this overwhelming sense of confirmation from him that I'm telling you to get off of them. Not you telling you to get off of them, I'm telling you. And I think that was the first step for me as the shepherd of our household, the headship of our household, as a husband to you, where I began to come to terms with the reality. Because like I said, getting off of antidepressants, I began to feel the effects of burnout, and it began to take a physical toll on my body. And it was really hard for me to find joy. Not because pregnancy isn't a gift, it is, but because I was actively avoiding so many different things at that time and sanitizing it with antidepressants. And now getting off of it, it was hard for me to process what should be a blissful moment with pregnancy, only for less than a month later to have lost our baby while dealing with burnout and coming off of antidepressants. And kind of in a sense doing it alone. It wasn't about after our miscarriage that I finally told you that I was sober for 5 months off of my antidepressants, which I don't recommend. If you're gonna make decisions like that, y'all, make sure you talk to your spouse. She was very gracious, but don't do that. And at the same time using language that did give life to the reality that I was burnt out and that I was going through a lot of struggles within that at the time.
Yeah, and I think looking back, like, the Lord knew, right, that he needed to be off his antidepressants at that time, because I think in a way it was going to help you process through it, even though it's harder, right, but you're more sensitized, right, resensitized to dealing with it the right way. And so I think through our miscarriage, like now, right, we can look back on it. I see how God used it, you know, for good. The Bible tells us, right, that he uses all things for good. And I know it's hard to see that, like, in those moments. But coming out of it, you know, at that time, me and my sister actually both miscarried at the same time. We were still, like, rebuilding, like, relationships in our family, with parents, with siblings.
Just everything.
Yeah, it was just a lot going on at that time. And like he said, because of his work in ministry, it was very demanding, and that was like our first year of marriage. Right, we were dealing with that and the miscarriage all within our first year of marriage. So we really hadn't built like a good foundation that first year, because we were so just busy and a lot had happened. And so I think this really forced us to stop and reconsider a lot of things in our life. And so God used our baby, you know, that is in heaven now, to just reveal these areas in our life that we needed to reprioritize and rethink. Obviously, first of all, putting God first, you know. Ministry is not above God, so, you know, we really needed to start focusing on our individual relationships with God, our marriage, second to that, and just building a stronger foundation again. And so, you know, God in his mercy, like, we don't understand why in those moments, like, we had to lose our baby, but now, you know, years later and reflecting on it, I just see, like, how we used it to bring our family closer together and to mend relationships there, and to start the healing process in our marriage. Not that it was broken, but in that first year we didn't really have the time to build like that intimacy in our marriage. Out of that, you know, we just reevaluated like everything with his work and ministry and what life was going to look like moving forward from that. But, you know, in that we both were grieving very differently. I was like struggling with, I want to have another baby, you know, because I think it came from losing that one baby, and now that desire's there, right? And but I'm just trying to heal the wound by having another baby. And so we really had to work through that, and just God had to work on my heart, and through a lot of prayer, God was just like, you need to let your husband grieve first of all, because we talked about it and he wasn't ready for us to get pregnant again. Because he didn't want to see me go through that.
That was
not
hard.
That, you know, it was going to happen again, but it was hard for him, and he wasn't ready, you know, for us to get pregnant. And as my husband, you know, I needed to respect his grieving process. But in that, God also showed me like the intentions of my heart, right? That children aren't just something we willy-nilly get to have, you know. Children are a gift from him, and having another kid wasn't going to fix, you know, what was going on. And so God was gracious, you know, to also teach me like patience in that, and how to respect your spouse and their needs and their grieving process, and how to pray for your spouse. And so, you know, losing our baby taught us so much, and our marriage is so much stronger for it because of it. And that baby had a great purpose, you know, and
still does
to this day.
Absolutely. Personally, I witnessed a lot within myself. There was a lot of internal struggle in the aftermath, to where And this was not easy to admit to you. It wasn't easy to admit to myself. In fact, I can't remember if it was a pastor or a therapist first, one or the other. In any case, I talked about this. I kind of felt like I was going through identity crisis at that point. There was no doubt in my mind, and still no doubt in my mind, that God is real and that I believe that he loves me in spite of me. But outside of that simple but profound revelation, I don't believe I had the strongest foundation, at least one that I should have had going into a marriage. She had no doubt about my ability to lead, but when it came to enduring hardship, which in and of itself is going to be difficult, I didn't have the strongest foundation to stand on. And it was often because I vicariously lived out my relationship with Christ through ministry. And like you shared earlier, ministry does not come above Christ. God comes first, and then ministry is an outpouring of that relationship that we have. But unfortunately, at that point in time, because I'd gotten so immersed in full-time ministry work in a time of need, where I needed a job and the Lord was gracious to present a ministry opportunity, I just didn't go in with the right mindset. And though the Lord was faithful and good in his provision for us, that this job enabled me to move forward with marrying you, in that process, I had allowed ministry to come first before my relationship with Christ. And I'm grateful to be on the other side of it now, where I don't feel ashamed to admit this, but this is where I was around the time we miscarried. I only opened my Bible when I would prep devos for prayer meetings, or on Sunday service with the worship team, or Thursday service with the worship team. Basically, whenever there was a need logistically in preparation for a service, that would be the only time I opened my Bible. And anybody would tell you that that's simply not a healthy practice. And because there was so much to do at the time, and I just did not know how to say no, I was running on empty the entire time and barely filling up the tank, just enough to get to the next service, and then just hope I had enough to get home afterwards. And I lived on that mentality for 2 years, not only leading up to our marriage, but then after we got married. And losing our first baby really opened my eyes to consider where I was in my relationship with Christ. Again, this isn't a scenario where I deconstructed or doubted Christ as far as no longer believing in him, but just simply coming to terms with the reality that I did not have a relationship with him outside of ministry. That was something that was very difficult for me to process on top of everything else, because at this point I had also, after praying about it for over a year with you, leaving my job. And that was scary for the both of us, because at that time we also struggled with this idea and with control and things that are not necessarily bad, but if we put our faith in that, it could cause us to crumble so fast because it's not a strong enough foundation to bolster the pressure of life. Yeah. That was a huge step of faith for us, because I went from working full-time ministry to working at a shoe store and shooting content on the side, and I thought, okay, maybe I'm gonna be a photographer and do freelance work, and for a time I did that. And it just simply didn't yield good fruit. It didn't really yield any fruit, and it's simply because that's not what the Lord wanted me to do. I had to be brutally honest with you, which again was embarrassing, difficult to say, and I think difficult for you to process, that I basically almost didn't know what I was supposed to do with my life, which is crazy to think about or consider when I'm a newlywed trying to process a miscarriage and just trying to move forward. But something that the Lord really convicted us on was to start doing devos together every morning. We were gifted a daily devotion. We actually still do it to this day.
Yeah. Our son has now ripped the cover off.
Yes. It's got patina and wear. It's a family heirloom now.
Yeah.
But we just started faithfully doing that devo, and I'm grateful to say that from 2022 to now, there's been a dramatic shift in our dialogue through this devo, because we try our best, but we don't do every single day. And naturally, the more you progress in this kind of practice, where not only are you fellowshipping with each other in a different way, but also fellowshipping with Christ, I've seen a dramatic shift in how we respond to the devos, how we interact with it, how we interact with each other. And I believe that's indicative of the growth that the Lord has graciously bestowed upon us because of our enduring. I think it's fair to consider that we reached many points during the process of this miscarriage where Not that we would get divorced or not that we would separate, but we got to those points mentally and emotionally where we realized, oh, this is where people would part ways because it's so difficult.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say is like, we definitely reached a lot of like points where it was like, wow, these could be really like make or break moments. Like, I mean, miscarriage itself, you know, losing our baby and him like leaving his full-time job, like that was a huge transition. And because for me, like I grew up very financially conscious and I struggled with that when we got married of just like wanting to hold on to money so tight, and us both working full-time still didn't feel like enough, right? Which that's a problem because it was enough at the time.
Was more than enough.
But right, you struggle with that mentally. It's like, for me, it wasn't going to be enough probably ever, you know, at that point in our marriage. So him leaving his job was like a huge step of faith, but for the better, you know. I think that it taught us to not put our trust in money, but to really start, again, putting God back in that first position of like, he's in charge of everything. He's the provider, you know, and so we put our eyes back on him and really started prioritizing him. And then like we were talking about, you know, God is before ministry, but ministry also begins like with our marriage. And so that's like kind of like the whole point of this podcast is like, we learned through all of that and all of those trials and things that could have broken us up that like, okay, first of all, God always has to be number one in our own time, and then also in our marriage, right? Before we start pouring out into ministry, or before you started going back into ministry full time.
Because I almost walked away.
Yeah, he almost walked away from it. It was like we needed to get that right, like in our marriage and in our own individual walks. And so through that whole season, God was slowly working on those things in our heart through these circumstances. For me, it was letting go of the financial need, of security. The Lord wanted us to lay a lot at his feet. And he did it quickly in our like first 2 years of marriage. He's like, all right, we're just going to get it all done now. But it was beautiful, you know, and now, you know, like he was saying, once we started like really prioritizing God, and especially in our marriage of just doing a simple thing as devos. I remember when we first started, it like almost felt awkward, which it shouldn't, right? But like it was because we weren't doing it. Or it
felt weird.
Like, and I didn't know how to answer the questions at first. But now, you know, we've been doing what for like 2 years?
2 years.
Now it's like the conversations are much deeper and richer, even though we've done some of them already. It's like, oh, but we've learned more and we've gone deeper. And so it's just beautiful to see how God really works in your life, you know, through these hardships, if you allow him, right? You have to be willing to be changed and to grow from these circumstances. Because we could have just sat in all that sadness and all that uncertainty.
Oh, totally.
And we could have just been stuck and not allowed God to change us and grow our marriage. But I think we both had a willingness to like, hey, things are not where they need to be right now. And we were willing to grow from that, you know, thank God. And now our marriage is stronger because of it.
No, absolutely. One thing that we've talked about a lot, kind of relating to my identity crisis, I conflated this idea of my value in Christ to what I did. My output as an employee, my execution as a worship leader, whatever the case may be. Failed to realize that all of those things are a result of who I am in Christ. Not what I do, but who I am. This 2-year process of having miscarried, then going to a different church, actually trying 3 different churches. We tried 3 to eventually getting pregnant with our son, Adriel. It has been a beautiful process of beginning to shift that perspective from my value in Christ, in his eyes, from what it is that I do to who I am in him. Because my identity is not in what he's gifted me with. My identity is simply that I was created in his image. That wasn't an easy thing to consider because it also meant I had to actively practice humility. I felt convicted on the fact, which is why we started doing the Devos, that I was kind of speaking to you a certain way or being a little too witty, but in a way that just wasn't appropriate. And just overall conduct that just didn't feel like an accurate representation of Christ. Recognizing that I'm not an exception to the rule and I have to seriously consider these things, especially if he were to call me back to ministry. Mind you, I was still technically leading worship at the time, but I was completely turned off to the idea of ever going back into it full time. Or at one point, literally just stopping worship altogether and just never doing ministry again, at least not in that way. Though it was a very interesting process, it also yielded so much beauty and fruit that I don't believe we would have experienced otherwise, because the Lord was so faithful to show us not only like we had to work on these things, but he was faithfully and graciously there in that process.
Yeah, and I think that was like an interesting time for me. So just for context, we miscarried in May, and we got pregnant in January of the next year.
Just a few, less than a year after.
Yeah, less than a year. So in that like 7 months, whatever it was, like, for me, I was just very much so obviously processing the miscarriage for a while.
Right.
But also just like learning as a wife, like how to pray for my husband, because there was a lot of things that I just didn't know what to do. Like, because he was going through so much at that time. And not that I wasn't, but I think if you're married, like it's just hard watching your spouse like go through things that you can't really do, right? I can't pick a career for him. I can't tell him what his calling is. I can tell him what I think his calling is or his gifts and encourage him in those things. But at a point, God was just telling me like, okay, you don't need to talk. You just need to pray for him. Through that season, God showed me like the true power of prayer, because I just was praying diligently for him, for our marriage, for God to give him guidance on what his calling was, and also that when we got pregnant again, that we would both be joyful about it and be able to experience joy. We didn't know it was going to happen soon, but God in his graciousness in those 7 months, like answered so many prayers and eventually brought us to a church that we were at for a while in Oceanside that we learned a lot there. And I think it reignited your, calling for worship and ministry.
I'd agree,
in a less like intense environment. It was a very like small church.
Very intimate.
Intimate. But it kind of took the pressure off of you to allow you to like kind of just relearn to just enjoy it. Just getting to see that and just the Lord answering prayers. And I just learned a lot about like patience and the power of prayer, how to prioritize our marriage, and part of that is prayer as a wife. So
looking back, because hindsight's always 20/20, really reconsidering what ministry looked like. So to your point, going to the church in Oceanside that we were a part of for literally a year, we were legitimately considering planting ourselves there because we loved the pastor, we still do, and his wife, and of course the congregation there. They were just incredibly nurturing and welcoming, which is exactly what we needed. It was a godsend in the sense that I thought we were going there to meet a need, which on a practical level we were, because they no longer had a worship director and a team. Literally the last Sunday at our church in Los Angeles, I get a text from this pastor. And, jokingly, he's like, come move to Oceanside, and, so on and so forth. And the Lord...
I wish.
I wish. I mean, she loves
I love
San Diego, so that would have worked out. But they were so incredibly nurturing and gracious with us, because for the first time I was beginning to open up about things that I just felt like I wasn't allowed to talk about. And to be frank, it was just lies from the enemy. Like, you're not allowed to talk about this, you're a leader, you have to just put on a face and just get it all together because this isn't for you. And I believed those lies. I think I lost trust in myself and my ability or even willingness to be vulnerable because I was afraid of what people would think of me. The pastor at Oceanside, the Lord used to cultivate a great healing in me that needed to take place. It reshaped my perspective of ministry and recognizing that it is an outpouring, a result of my relationship with Christ, which is why that needs to come first. And slowly but surely began to find joy in it again. And not just treating it like a chore or something that I'm obligated to do because it's my job or whatever the case may be. Like, it's an incredible honor being able to serve the local body and almost getting back to this like innocent, almost ignorant mindset of just simply put, like 14-year-old Ben having a desire to serve his church.
Yeah.
Like, I literally just wanted to be in church all the time. And I basically was. If I wasn't homeschooling, competing, doing classical piano, I was at church. And they would have to kick me out because I just didn't want to leave. So kind of going back to that mindset helped me to have more joy and be excited for this pregnancy with Adriel. In fact, at that point, we had videos from when we were pregnant with our first baby to Adriel, and just looking at those videos side by side, I saw a huge contrast in our demeanor overall, not just with the pregnancy, but I think overall perspective, like in life. We had a lot more joy at that point in time. So this was February 4th of 2023. And I know that because she woke me up and I was half asleep doing something, and she had like a bachelorette party.
I had a bachelorette party that day, and I was like, I better take this test.
Yeah, better take this test and make sure, just so I know how to, carry on.
I was pretty sure because all the symptoms were there, but we found out, and we both were just way more excited. Not that we 100%. Weren't the first time, but again, there was more of that like fear and control in our life at that time that we were like, oh, this is gonna derail everything. Right. Whereas this time we were like, even though it was unexpected, we were like just much more joyful. And I think because we had submitted to God's will for our life, and we had a healthy relationship with Him, and our marriage was in a much better place.
Much more healthy,
so we were excited to find out, and we'll talk more about how that pregnancy went. And
a lot of good nuggets to share from that experience. And I think prayerfully will encourage you guys. If you guys are going through a miscarriage, we're sorry, first and foremost. We could empathize fully with the pain, the grief, the sorrow that comes with that. But we're also grateful that we serve a God that has declared victory over every circumstance, including miscarriages and everything that comes with that. In fact, those babies are at home with Him in perfection. But at the very least, be encouraged that you guys are not alone if you're going through that. If you guys need someone to talk to, that's what we're here for. We desire to serve those of you guys that might be going through that. For those of you guys that are going through first-time pregnancies and preparing to become parents, that's ultimately what we're here for as well. That's why this exists, because there were a lot of things, and we'll talk about this in the next episode, that we did not anticipate going into pregnancy with Adriel along with the birthing process. And I know that you approached me about it with wanting to do this in the hopes to offer some clarity, some encouragement, some reassurance to you women, to you mothers-to-be that are understandably anxious. So I'm definitely looking forward to talking about that. I think it's going to be great. But I wanted to leave you guys with one verse. It has become a life verse for me. Psalm 37, verse 4. It says, "Delight in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart." The reality is we need Christ. But He desires for us to want Him just as much as He wants a relationship with us. And when we choose to delight in His presence, despite the hardship, despite the million feelings that come with something like a miscarriage or trying to establish the bedrock foundation of your marriage, when you choose to delight in the Lord, no matter how easy or difficult, the desires of your heart will be granted because His desires have become yours. His will has become yours. And that is something that the Lord has challenged me with. Giving credence to it through this actual passage is something I wanted to leave you guys with. Through the hardship of a new marriage, the growing pains there, through the difficulties and heartbreak of a miscarriage, delight in the Lord. Be faithful in that. And I believe He will give you the desires of your heart. His promises are yes and amen, and we can find rest in that. We can find comfort in that. Be confident in that simple but profound fact. But that said, thank you guys. Do you have anything?
No, thank you guys for listening. I think just sharing experiences is important just so people don't feel alone, because those circumstances can feel very lonely. So thank you guys for just listening, and we'll see you next time.
God bless.